In the 16th century, a Spanish soldier captured in the Americas is dragged up these steep, blood-stained steps of a stone temple.
Right.
He is held down on an altar, his heart is physically removed from his chest, and as his body tumbles down the temple steps, he cries out to his surviving friends in Spanish.
It is a brutal historical image.
It is. But then, half a world away, centuries earlier, you have Viking tribes systematically drowning 99 men in the freezing waters of January.
Yes.
And if you jump back even further to the ancient Near East, you find kings placing their own children in the fire to appease unseen gods.
Across completely different eras.
Right, so we are talking about populations separated by vast, uncrossable oceans and thousands of years of history. How did entirely disconnected civilizations arrive at the precise same horrifying solution for their guilt?
Well, it defies natural sociological development. When you observe human behavior across isolated populations, you expect massive variations in how they govern or how they build and how they solve problems.
They should look to.
But when you look at the human conscience attempting to resolve its own guilt before the divine, that variation just vanishes. You see a terrifying uniformity.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today's deep dive is custom-tailored for you, the listener. We are unpacking a challenging, staggering historical and theological text.
We are investigating a dissertation on divine justice by the English Puritan theologian John Owen.
And our mission today is highly specific. We are going to examine John Owen's historical and scriptural analysis of one of the darkest human practices imaginable, which is human sacrifice.
Yes, and our goal is to uncover what this global, horrifying custom reveals about the innate human conscience. We want to see the natural knowledge of God's vindicatory justice and the absolute necessity of a true, perfect substitute for sin.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the start. We are talking about the geographical and cultural scope of blood atonement.
It is a massive scope.
I want to pitch a mechanical analogy to you, the listener, to frame what we are looking at. Imagine finding the precise same corrupted software code on completely disconnected computers all over the globe.
I like that analogy.
Machines that have never been on the same network, built by entirely different companies, separated by oceans. Yet, under enough processing stress, they all crash in the precise same way.
Displaying the precise same fatal error message.
Right. John Owen argues that human sacrifice is essentially that fatal error message.
And if we apply that software model to John Owen's catalog of cultures, the geographical spread defies any natural explanation.
It really does.
He details historical testimonies from civilizations that had zero contact with one another. Let us start with the ancient Near East, specifically looking at the Jews.
Okay.
Owen points out that even the covenant people who possessed the revealed law of God fell into this forbidden wickedness.
Which requires us to pause and think about the context. These are the descendants of the Exodus.
Yes.
These are the people who received the law at Sinai, where God explicitly outlawed these practices. Yet the gravitational pull of blood sacrifice was so strong it overrode their explicit legal code.
It demonstrates the sheer force of a guilty conscience. When the Israelites turned away from the true worship of God, their conscience did not simply go quiet.
It demanded appeasement.
Right. They were urged on by the immense psychological pressure of a terrified conscience, and they began offering their own children as burnt offerings to Moloch or Baal.
And Baal, in this context, was essentially the Saturn of the Tyrians.
Yes. The rituals involved heating a hollow bronze statue of the god from below until it was glowing red hot.
Wow.
And then placing an infant into its arms. The beating of drums would drown out the cries.
That is just unimaginable.
God severely punished them for this, sending prophets to condemn the valley of Hinnom where this took place. But the internal urge driving the Israelites to do it was overwhelming.
So that covers the ancient Near East. But Owen does not stop there. He moves the lens to Northern Europe.
He brings in the historical records of the Germans and the Goths. Owen references the Roman historian Tacitus and the Gothic historian Jornandus.
What do they record?
They document how these tribes worship their equivalent of Mercury by sacrificing human victims on specific days. They also appease their god of war, Mars, with the violent deaths of their captives.
So it was not a chaotic, heat-of-the-moment slaughter on a battlefield.
No, it was highly systematized. The warfare itself was brutal, sure, but the religious appeasement following the warfare was calculated. Ritualistic murder.
Right.
They believed that the blood spilled in combat was insufficient. A formal religious execution was required to balance the cosmic scales and secure future favor.
If you are listening to this on your commute or at the gym, it is easy to write these people off as ancient, uneducated barbarians. You might think, well, they just did not have science or philosophy yet.
But Owen anticipates that.
He does. He looks at the centers of classical civilization.
He looks directly at the Gauls and the Romans. Owen brings in Cicero and Julius Caesar's first-hand accounts of the Druids.
And the Druids were not mindless savages.
Not at all. They were the intellectual, legal, and religious elite of Celtic society. They memorized massive amounts of lore, studied astronomy, and philosophized about the nature of the gods.
And Caesar notes a specific Druidic doctrine that should make anyone familiar with Reformed theology stop and pay attention.
Here is where it gets highly fascinating.
What was the doctrine?
Caesar recorded that the Druids believed, unless a human life be given for a human life, the heavenly deities cannot be appeased.
Let me stop you right there. A human life for a human life. That sounds identical to the theological concept of penal substitution.
It is a dark, distorted reflection of the actual truth. We need to define what penal substitution is in a biblical framework to see why this is so terrifying.
Please do.
Penal substitution asserts that the penalty for sin, which is death, must be paid. God's justice requires it.
Right.
But God, in His grace, provides a substitute to endure that penal consequence in the place of the guilty party. Jesus Christ is that substitute.
Okay.
The Druids grasped the first half of that equation with chilling clarity. They recognized the scale of human guilt and concluded that animal blood was insufficient.
They reasoned that if a human committed the offense against heaven, a human life had to be the payment.
Yes. They understood the mechanism of the debt, but they were completely blind to the identity of the true payer. So they just started grabbing people to settle the ledger.
They built massive wicker men, filled them with living people.
Often thieves or captives, but innocent people if they ran short, and they set them on fire.
And this logic was not isolated to Gaul.
No. Tacitus records the cruel superstitions in the groves of Anglesey among the Britons, where they sacrificed guests and captives, reading the future in the entrails of the murdered.
And the timeline just keeps extending. We see the practices of the Franks.
Yes, the historian Procopius writes about them.
He says the Franks made use of human victims even after they nominally adopted Christianity. They would throw captives into the river as the vanguard of their army crossed, mixing pagan appeasement with Christian military campaigns.
It is a bizarre mixture.
We see it with the Normans. We see the Danes sacrificing 99 human creatures every January to secure the coming year. The Egyptians had systems of human sacrifice. And then, crossing the Atlantic entirely, we hit the Americas.
Which brings us back to the Spanish soldier you mentioned in the introduction.
Right. Owen references Peter Martyr's account of the Spanish conquest. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, they encountered civilizations that had been utterly severed from the Eurasian landmass for thousands of years.
They had no contact with the Druids, no contact with the Tyrians, no contact with the Danes.
Yet they had constructed massive pyramidal altars specifically designed for blood atonement.
The Aztec Empire ran on an economy of human sacrifice. They believed the sun would literally stop moving and the universe would collapse if the gods were not fed with human hearts.
The sheer volume of executions carried out to appease their deities is historically staggering.
So what does this all mean? We have this global footprint of blood and altars. How does Owen synthesize this mountain of horrific data into a theological verdict?
Owen argues that this universal panic proves something fundamental about human nature. Mankind possesses an innate, unerasable sense of sin.
In Reformed theology, we often refer to the Westminster Confession's teaching on the light of nature.
Yes, the confession states that there is a natural knowledge of God and of our own accountability.
And Owen uses this historical record to prove that the light of nature is not a comfortable, gentle glow.
It is not a warm feeling.
No. When the conscience is activated by guilt, that light becomes a glaring spotlight of condemnation. Humanity inherently knows it is guilty, and humanity has an inherent expectation of future, terrifying judgment.
They know the ledger's in the red. They know justice is coming. They just do not know how to clear the debt.
Correct. They feel the absolute weight of God's vindicatory justice. But without the special revelation of the gospel, without knowing about the cross of Christ, they resort to the most extreme, horrifying measures to try and balance the scales themselves.
They attempt to manufacture their own substitute. Okay, that establishes the what. We see the global footprint of this practice, and we see the psychological engine driving it. A guilty conscience terrified of divine justice.
Right.
But I want to shift the conversation to the how and why. If humans have this innate knowledge of God's justice, why did it manifest in such abominable, counterproductive ways? Let's bring in the demonic element Owen discusses.
That is a crucial part of his argument.
And I want to push back on Owen's premise here. If the enemy of mankind, the devil, wants to pull people away from God, why encourage any form of religious worship or sacrifice at all?
That is a fair question.
Wouldn't the devil prefer straightforward atheism? Just convince everyone that God does not exist, there is no judgment, and they can do whatever they want. Why bother with all these complex, bloody rituals?
That is a highly logical question for a person living in a post-Enlightenment, secularized world. But it completely misunderstands the ancient mind and the nature of the human conscience.
Yeah.
John Owen provides a brilliant framework for understanding the devil's two-pronged strategy. You see, atheism is actually an incredibly difficult concept to sell to an ancient mind.
Because they live so close to the elements.
Exactly. They were surrounded by the terrifying, uncontrollable realities of nature, storms, famines, plagues, and they possessed that screaming internal conscience we just discussed. They knew they were accountable to a higher power.
So the devil realizes he cannot simply turn off the conscience.
He cannot erase the hardware of the human soul. So instead of trying to delete the conscience, he manipulates the software.
Okay, I am following.
The first prong of his strategy, according to Owen, is counterfeit worship. The enemy knew the prophecies. He knew the Son of God was coming in the fullness of time to be the one, true, perfect substitute for human sin.
So he decides to flood the market with fakes.
Yes. Think about how counterfeit currency works. If you want to undermine a nation's legitimate currency, you don't just tell people money doesn't exist.
Right, you print millions of high-quality forged bills and flood the economy with them.
And by the time the real currency is handed to someone, they are completely suspicious of it. The devil influenced nations to commit these detestable crimes, to preemptively obscure the light of the true sacrifice.
Wow.
By filling the globe with endless, horrific human sacrifices, he created a chaotic, bloody counterfeit.
I see. So when the true sacrifice, Jesus Christ, is finally offered on the cross, the concept of a man dying for the sins of the people is already deeply associated with the worst, most barbaric practices of the pagan world.
Yes.
The Romans look at the cross and think, well, we have seen this before in the forests of Gaul. This is just primitive superstition.
Precisely. Which leads directly to the second prong of the demonic strategy, which is poisoning the well.
Poisoning the well.
The counterfeit worship trapped the desperate, terrified masses, but the devil also needed a strategy for the educated elite.
The philosophers.
Right. By associating blood atonement with horrific, atrocious rites, the devil aimed to prejudice the more acute, intelligent, philosophical parts of mankind against the very concept of a life-giving sacrifice.
He wanted the statesmen, the educated class, to look at the mechanics of atonement and say, that is irrational barbarism. We are too advanced for that.
Owen cites a classical example from Cato's Distichs to demonstrate this. The Distichs were a collection of Latin proverbial wisdom, heavily studied in Roman schools.
What's the verse say?
The specific verse Owen points to reads, "Since it is thyself that art guilty, why need any victim die for thee? It is madness to expect salvation from the death of another."
If I am entirely honest, that verse makes a lot of logical sense.
It does to a human mind.
If I commit a crime today, say I rob a bank, the judge cannot legally sentence my innocent neighbor to prison while letting me go free. Our entire modern legal system is based on individual culpability. How does my neighbor's punishment satisfy my legal debt?
That is exactly why Owen calls that verse a diabolical oracle. It appeals to natural human legal logic. It sounds sophisticated.
It is a very clean argument.
But the devil designed that philosophical argument to trap the intellectual class in their own pride. By making the concept of substitution seem like intellectual madness, he ensures that educated people will reject the only actual mechanism God provided for salvation.
It is a devastating trap. If you are terrified and uneducated, you fall into the ditch of barbaric superstition, slaughtering captives to appease a silent sky.
Yeah.
And if you are educated and comfortable, you fall into the ditch of intellectual pride, rejecting the concept of substitution entirely because it offends your human legal sensibilities. Either way, you miss the true substitute. You miss Christ.
And this leads to a fascinating historical dynamic.
Hmm.
All of this pagan distortion, this counterfeit worship, and this philosophical pride did not develop in a vacuum.
The biblical narrative was unfolding at the same time.
The actual timeline of redemptive history was playing out on the exact same world stage. The surrounding ancient nations were watching the Israelites.
This is a perspective we often miss. When we read the Old Testament, we tend to read it like a closed-room drama, just God and Israel in a bubble.
But the neighboring nations, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, the Edomites, they were looking over the fence. They were observing the patriarchs.
They were observing, but they were completely misunderstanding the context of God's actions. Let us look at one of the most pivotal moments in redemptive history, which is the trial of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22.
The binding of Isaac.
Right. God orders Abraham to take his son, his only son Isaac, whom he loves, to the region of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering.
It is the ultimate test of faith. Abraham obeys. He travels for 3 days, builds the altar, binds his son, and raises the knife.
He demonstrates a sincere heart and resolute faith.
In fact, the writer of Hebrews tells us that Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. The Holy Spirit credits Abraham as if he had actually offered Isaac because his internal compliance was total.
But the crucial part of the narrative is that God stops him. The angel of the Lord calls out from heaven, halts the execution, and God provides a ram caught in the thicket, a substitute for the substitute.
Exactly. But how did the surrounding world interpret this event? Abraham was a wealthy, powerful figure in the ancient Near East. The fame of this event spread across the Eastern nations.
They heard the rumors.
Owen argues that nations ignorant of Abraham's true covenantal friendship with God simply saw him as a powerfully strong, holy man who commanded respect.
So they looked at the story of Moriah and falsely concluded that the divine could be propitiated by the sacrifice of a child.
They saw the setup. They saw the wood, the fire, the son on the altar, but they completely missed the resolution.
They missed the voice from heaven saying, "Do not lay a hand on the boy."
Or worse, they assumed that the willingness to slaughter your own child was the ultimate cheat code to unlocking divine favor. They thought, well, if Abraham got so rich and powerful because he was willing to kill his son, we should actually do it.
Owen provides a historical connection here that is deeply unsettling. He cites the writings of Porphyry.
Yes, Porphyry was a Neoplatonic philosopher who recorded the religious customs of the Phoenicians.
And Porphyry notes that the Phoenicians, in times of great national disaster, such as war, famine, or plague, would sacrifice one of their dearest friends or beloved children to appease their gods.
Not an enemy, not a prisoner of war, a beloved child.
Which mirrors the specific command given to Abraham, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love."
Yes. And Owen traces a linguistic and genealogical theory to explain how this specific distortion spread. He notes that the word Phoenician means red.
Right.
This links linguistically to Edom, which also translates to red.
And Edom is the nation descended from Esau, Isaac's son.
Precisely. Owen suggests that the Phoenicians, or the Idumeans who descended from Esau, corrupted the oral tradition of their own patriarch.
Think about the bitter rivalry between Jacob and Esau. Esau was the slighted older brother. His descendants carried that animosity.
It is highly plausible that they remembered the traumatic story of their grandfather Isaac being bound on the altar by Abraham.
But over generations, stripped of divine revelation, they twisted that historical memory into a recurring ritual requirement.
That is wild. So the very historical event God used to definitively demonstrate that he will provide the substitute, the ram in the thicket, pointing directly to Jesus Christ on the cross, the surrounding nations weaponized.
They twisted it into a mandate to kill their own loved ones.
It illustrates the immense danger of human tradition separated from the Word of God. And Owen is careful to clarify why God strictly forbade human sacrifice, both at Moriah and later in the Levitical law.
The first reason is straightforward. God values human life and intends to protect human blood from murder.
But there is a much heavier theological mechanism at play.
What is a mechanical theological reason?
We established that God's vindicatory justice requires a substitute, but that substitute must meet specific criteria.
Okay.
All mankind is polluted with iniquity. We inherit a sinful nature and we commit active sins. Therefore, no normal human being could ever act as a true, efficacious type for the immaculate Son of God.
Let me make sure I understand this. You cannot pay a bankrupt man's debt by offering the empty wallet of another bankrupt man.
That is an excellent analogy. A sinful human dying for another sinful human accomplishes nothing in the court of divine justice because the substitute already owes a debt for their own sin.
They have no surplus righteousness to apply to someone else.
The substitute must be spotless. Isaac was spared not just because God hates human sacrifice, but because Isaac was a sinner. He was fundamentally disqualified from being the true lamb.
Only a perfect, sinless human could satisfy the demand, which is why the incarnation of Christ is an absolute necessity.
Okay, that makes perfect logical sense for the story of Abraham and Isaac.
Oh.
It was an aborted sacrifice meant to point to God's provision.
But we have to address the most difficult text in this entire discussion. We are moving from a sacrifice that God stopped to a vow that was actually carried out.
You are referring to the history of Jephthah.
Yes, the Jephthah dilemma in Judges chapter 11. I will admit this text has frustrated me for a long time.
It is a notoriously difficult passage.
We have this man, Jephthah, who is explicitly celebrated for his faith in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Yet, in Judges, he appears to sacrifice his own daughter as a burnt offering.
It is a massive textual knot.
I need you to walk the listener through the specific legal and historical frameworks Owen uses to untangle this.
It requires careful, rigorous legal analysis. Let us establish the facts of the narrative. Jephthah is a military commander in Israel.
Right.
He is facing a massive existential threat from the Ammonite army. Before heading into battle, he makes a vow to the Lord.
He says, "If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering."
He wins a crushing victory, he returns home, and the first thing to come out of his house is his only daughter, dancing to celebrate his return.
And the text says he tore his clothes in despair, told her about the vow, and after giving her 2 months to mourn her virginity, he did to her as he had vowed.
Right. Owen thoroughly dissects the 3 possible interpretations of this vow, based strictly on the Levitical law code that Jephthah would have been operating under.
What is option 1?
Option 1 is that it was a simple, singular vow with a clause for redemption.
Break down the mechanics of a simple vow for us.
Under Leviticus chapter 27, if an Israelite made a singular voluntary vow dedicating a human being to the Lord, say, dedicating themselves or a family member to service at the tabernacle, they could legally redeem that person.
They could pay a specific valuation to the priest.
Yes. For a female between the ages of 5 and 20, the redemption price was 10 shekels of silver.
So if it was a simple vow, Jephthah just goes to the priest, hands over 10 silver coins, and his daughter lives and goes free.
Yes. But Owen dismisses this interpretation entirely.
Why?
Jephthah was a seasoned leader in Israel. He was familiar with the law and Israelite history, as we see in his earlier diplomatic messages to the Ammonite king. If he had made a simple vow, he could have easily paid the valuation.
That makes sense.
There would be absolutely no reason for him to rend his clothes, collapse in grief, and say his daughter had brought him very low. The trauma in the text makes no sense if a 10-shekel loophole existed.
Okay, that eliminates option 1. What is option 2?
Option 2 is the literal interpretation. He offered her physically as a burnt offering on an altar, burning her to ashes, as the raw text of his vow originally stated.
But Owen vigorously dismisses this as well.
He does.
But wait, if Jephthah was a military leader in Israel, he knows God hates human burnt offerings. He physically couldn't drag his daughter to a Levitical priest at the tabernacle and ask them to perform a human sacrifice.
The priest would have refused, and he likely would have been stoned by the congregation. So how could option 2 even happen? It couldn't legally happen within the framework of Israelite worship? A burnt offering requires a consecrated priest to minister the blood and arrange the pieces on the bronze altar.
No legitimate Levitical priest would have participated in such an abomination.
God had explicitly condemned human burnt offerings as the practice of the surrounding pagans. Jephthah could not have executed a legitimate, sanctioned burnt offering with a human victim.
So if he cannot buy her back with silver, and he cannot burn her on the altar because the priests would reject it, what loophole did he think he was falling through? What is option 3?
Option 3 relies on a very specific, severe category of devotion found at the very end of Leviticus chapter 27. It's called the cherem vow.
Cherem. Explain the mechanics of that.
The cherem vow is a declaration of devotion to destruction. Think of it like an irrevocable legal trust. In modern finance, if you place an asset into an irrevocable trust, you forfeit all ownership forever.
There is no legal mechanism to buy it back or change your mind. The asset is gone.
In the Levitical system, a cherem was a thing devoted to God that absolutely could not be redeemed with silver.
What kinds of things were put under a cherem vow?
It was typically applied to the enemies of God, For instance, when Israel conquered Jericho, the entire city was declared cherem, devoted to destruction.
No plunder could be kept. Every living thing had to be put to the sword.
Right. The law in Leviticus 27, verse 29 states explicitly, no person devoted to destruction may be ransomed. They are to be put to death.
So you were saying Jephthah accidentally categorized his own daughter as an enemy combatant devoted to destruction.
That is Owen's rigorous conclusion. Jephthah made a rash, overly broad vow, categorizing whatever came out of his house as cherem.
He may have assumed an animal would come out, or perhaps a slave he could dedicate to temple service.
But by framing the vow as absolute and unredeemable, he trapped himself. When his daughter emerged, he believed he was legally banned by the highest, most severe law of devotion.
He adhered strictly to the law of the cherem vow.
Yes, turning her over to be put to death, even though his original conception of the vow was deeply flawed and foolish. He did not burn her on an altar in a religious ritual, but she was executed because she could not be redeemed.
That is an unbelievable tragedy. It is a portrait of a man entirely trapped by his own legalism.
Constrained by a flawed understanding of God's desires and paralyzed by a rash oath.
It is a devastating tragedy, and its impact radiated outward. The surrounding nations saw this happen. They saw a great judge of Israel seemingly sacrifice his daughter.
Owen points out that Epiphanius, an early church father, notes that the Samaritans later deified Jephthah's daughter, celebrating a yearly festival in her honor.
So we have more pagan distortion of biblical events.
It goes even further. The Greek poets seized upon this historical event, or the rumors of it that filtered through the trade routes, to create one of their most famous mythological dramas.
Which one?
Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter Iphigenia to appease the goddess Diana before the Trojan War.
I hear what Owen is saying about the linguistic shift from Jephthah to Iphigenia, but honestly, that sounds like a massive stretch. Is Owen just playing word games to force a connection between a biblical tragedy and a Greek myth? Or is there actual historical evidence for this translation pipeline?
It sounds like a stretch to our modern ears, but Owen is engaging in classical philology. He traces how the story of a commander sacrificing his daughter for military success would spread.
Okay.
In Greek, Jephthah's daughter would be rendered as Jephthagenia. Over centuries of oral transmission and linguistic drift among the Greeks, the pronunciation softens.
The J drops, the consonants shift, and Jephthagenia morphs into Iphigenia.
Owen argues that the historical tragedy in Israel provided the raw narrative hardware that the Greeks then dressed up in their own mythological software.
That interconnectedness is mind-blowing. It really shows how this desperate urge for atonement corrupts everything it touches.
It operates like a mechanical failure under pressure.
Think of a submarine diving too deep. Under normal conditions, the hull holds. But under extreme existential pressure, the hull cracks and the water rushes in.
Yes. We see the human conscience reach its breaking point when it is placed under the absolute pressure of despair.
When humanity abandons truth, or when the pressure of external circumstances crushes their natural reasoning, the terrified conscience takes over completely, demanding the ultimate appeasement.
Owen gives us two extreme historical cases that illustrate this submarine hull cracking perfectly.
Let's look at the first case. The King of Moab, recorded in 2 Kings chapter 3.
This is a brutal military narrative. The king of Moab is facing a combined coalition of the armies of Israel, Judah, and Edom.
He has been driven back to his capital city, Kir-Hareseth.
The city is surrounded, the siege engines are destroying the walls, and the water is likely running out. He is in absolute existential despair.
The text implies he attempts a desperate breakout maneuver with 700 swordsmen to break through the lines of the king of Edom, but he fails.
He is pushed back inside. He has no hope of escaping.
Total suffocating panic, the pressure is at maximum.
Exactly. So what does a pagan king do when military strategy fails and the conscience is screaming for divine intervention?
He takes his eldest son, the heir to his throne, and offers him as a burnt offering upon the city wall, in full view of the invading armies.
He does it to appease the god of his country, Chemosh.
Right. This showcases the extreme terminal logic of the terrified human conscience.
When a man feels the absolute weight of impending doom, the natural instinct is to offer the most valuable, most painful sacrifice possible.
He hopes that the sheer horror and cost of the act will force the heavens to intervene.
It is an act of total desperation to relieve the immediate, unbearable psychological and circumstantial pressure.
And the most disturbing part of that text is that it seems to work, at least circumstantially. The text says there was great indignation against Israel, and they actually withdrew and returned to their own land.
So from the king of Moab's twisted perspective, sacrificing his son saved his city, which only reinforces the demonic delusion we talked about earlier.
Precisely. The enemy uses circumstantial outcomes to validate the atrocity. The Israelites likely withdrew out of horror, disgust, or a breakdown in their own coalition's morale upon seeing the sacrifice.
But the Moabites interpreted it as Chemosh defeating the God of Israel because he was fed with royal blood.
Now, what about the second case of the conscience breaking? The Ruggiani of Sclavonia. You mentioned this in our prep notes, and it sounds like a psychological thriller.
It is a chilling historical account recorded by the German historian Albertus Crantius. It deals with the psychology of apostasy.
Who were the Ruggiani?
They were an island people in the Baltic Sea region. They were actually reached by missionaries and converted to Christianity. They adopted the faith, built an oratory in honor of Jesus Christ, and dedicated it in memory of St. Vitus, a Christian martyr.
Okay, so they have the light of the gospel. They have the true software installed. They are building churches.
But then they experienced a massive spiritual relapse. They fell away from the faith.
They expelled the Christian priests, drove out the believers, and completely abandoned the teachings of the gospel.
But they didn't become secular humanists.
Far from it. This is where the mechanics of apostasy become horrifying. You cannot simply uninstall the religious hardware of the human soul.
When they rejected the grace of the gospel, their conscience did not become neutral, it became terrified.
They reverted to their pagan operating system, but they used the leftover Christian terminology.
They took St. Vitus, the historical Christian martyr, and elevated him into a pagan, bloodthirsty deity.
Wait, they turned a Christian saint into an idol.
Yes. And to appease this new, terrifying god of their own making, they instituted a yearly ritual.
What did they do?
They would sacrifice any Christian they could catch or any random merchant who washed up on their shores, offering their blood to St. Vitus.
That is the most twisted irony I have ever heard. They took the gospel, threw away the grace, kept the name of a saint, and used it to justify murdering the very people who originally brought them the message of peace.
It is the ultimate proof of John Owen's central thesis. When the light of the gospel is rejected, the human conscience falls back on the innate demand for vindicatory justice.
But without the cross of Christ to satisfy that demand, the conscience demands fresh blood.
Superstition replaces grace, and violence replaces peace. The innate knowledge of justice, when divorced from the provision of Christ, is a machine that crushes human beings.
Okay, we need to bring this into the final theological verdict. We've spent this entire deep dive looking at the dark history, the twisted rituals, the psychological terror.
Yes, the heavy historical data.
Where does this universal urge to sacrifice actually come from fundamentally? And how does Owen apply this to the way we understand God today? Because if I look at a modern, secularized mindset, a lot of people, like the deists Owen debated in his own time, believe God is just naturally good.
They view God as a harmless grandfather in the sky.
The modern assumption is that God is easy to appease. He winks at our faults, he understands we are trying our best, and he doesn't require any severe payment for wrongs. Just try to be a good person, and the cosmic scales balance themselves out.
Right. It is a very comfortable, frictionless theology.
Owen uses the source material to completely dismantle that modern assumption.
He quotes a story from the Renaissance scholar Erasmus about a profane man, a joker, who is buying papal indulgences to clear his sins.
The man jokingly says, "I fear rather lest the devil should not ratify it, for God by nature is easy to be appeased."
He is treating God's justice like a punchline. He is more worried about the devil enforcing a contract than God caring about his sin.
Yes. And Owen contrasts that flippant, arrogant attitude with the universal terror of ancient man.
The ancients, who lived closer to the raw realities of life, death, and nature, knew better. They knew instinctively that a holy God is not easily appeased by a half-hearted apology or a purchased piece of paper.
They felt the crushing weight of their guilt.
Owen argues that the modern deist, or the modern secularist, is actually suppressing the natural knowledge of God much more severely than the ancient pagan was.
That is a fascinating way to look at it. The pagan was horribly wrong about the solution, killing captives or children, but they were dead right about the problem, human guilt and divine wrath.
The modern secularist is entirely wrong about both.
Well said. Owen then addresses counter-argument to his thesis. There was a theologian named Samuel Rutherford who argued that the Gentiles did not have an innate drive to sacrifice.
Rutherford theorized that the pagan nations just borrowed the idea of sacrifices from the Jewish ceremonial law.
They saw the Israelites killing bulls and goats, and they just copied the cultural practice, twisting it over time.
Meaning it wasn't an internal hardware issue, just a copied cultural trend, like wearing a certain style of clothing because you saw a neighboring country do it.
Yes, a theory of cultural diffusion. But Owen refutes this thoroughly by pointing to pre-Mosaic origins.
He proves that the mechanics of sacrifice predate Moses, Sinai, and the Levitical law by centuries.
Look at Job, who was not an Israelite and lived before the law was given. He is recorded offering burnt offerings for his children continually, just in case they sinned in their hearts.
Look at Jethro, the priest of Midian, offering sacrifices before the law was handed down.
Look at Manetho's Egyptian chronologies, which detail sacrificial systems long before the Exodus.
The timeline goes back way further than Moses.
Fundamentally, Owen traces it all the way back to the Garden of Eden. After the fall, Adam and Eve recognized their nakedness, their guilt, and they tried to cover their own shame with fig leaves.
That is the first instance of human effort trying to cover human sin. But it was insufficient. God himself intervened and clothed them in animal skins.
And you cannot get animal skins without an animal dying. Blood had to be shed to cover their shame.
Exactly. God himself ratified the first covenant of grace by shedding blood. From that moment on, mankind knew the central equation. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins.
That truth was passed down through oral tradition from Adam to Noah and outward to the nations. But it was also permanently implanted in the human conscience.
So we arrive at Owen's final philosophical argument.
He brings in the classical heavyweights of philosophy to validate his theological point. He quotes Aristotle, Hesiod, and Seneca.
They all operate on a basic principle of classical logic. The universe consent of mankind on a matter is a weighty argument for its fundamental truth.
If everybody, everywhere, across all time, independently believes a thing to be necessary, there is a core reality driving it.
Owen argues that the universal consent of mankind in the necessity of sacrifice proves that sin-avenging justice is natural to God. It is an implanted presumption that cannot be eradicated by philosophy or time.
God is fundamentally just. Sin must be punished to uphold the moral order of the universe, and therefore, a substitute is required.
Which brings us to the definition of vindicatory justice. I think we need to explain the mechanics of that phrase for the listener, because modern people usually think of justice in terms of restoration.
If I break your window, restorative justice says I need to pay for a new pane of glass. The goal is to restore the property to its original state.
But what happens if you murder someone? You cannot restore that life. Restorative justice is impossible in the face of death.
Vindicatory justice operates on a completely different axis. It argues that a moral law has been violated, an offense against the sovereign, holy lawgiver has occurred.
And that offense intrinsically requires a penalty to vindicate the moral order itself.
The punishment does not fix the broken window. The punishment proves that breaking the window was a crime.
Owen proves that the pagans instinctively knew vindicatory justice was real. They just lacked the true, spotless substitute to satisfy it.
So what does this all mean for us today? I want to summarize this deep dive for you, the listener. We have walked through a staggering, dark, historical landscape today.
We have examined human sacrifice across the globe, from the Druid wicker men in the forests of Gaul, to the horrific altars of the Aztec temples, to the psychological break of the King of Moab.
But all of this horror, all of this blood, actually points straight to the core truth of Reformed theology. Humanity is entirely aware of its guilt. We are entirely aware of God's vindicatory justice.
And we are hopelessly, terrifyingly lost when we try to balance the scales ourselves.
The mechanical failure of the human conscience under the pressure of guilt proves the absolute necessity of Jesus Christ. He is the perfect, spotless, once-for-all substitute that the ancient world was blindly, desperately searching for in the dark.
When we view human history through that specific lens, the cross of Christ is not just a theological concept. It becomes the only logical, loving answer to a universal, terrifying scream for justice.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you finish your commute or your workout. Look at the modern world around us. We like to think we have evolved past the ancients.
We no longer build stone altars in the center of our cities. We no longer offer our children to a glowing bronze statue of Moloch.
But look at society's current secular anxiety. Look at the intense, unforgiving desire to cancel others for their moral failures in the public square.
Look at the constant ravenous search for a public scapegoat to bear the sins of the culture, to be publicly ruined so the rest of us can feel clean.
How much of that modern behavior is driven by the precise same ancient, unerasable demand for vindicatory justice? A culture that has rejected the cross of Christ is still desperately crying out for a sacrifice to clear its conscience.
We haven't stopped demanding blood atonement. We just use digital stones and social ruin instead of physical altars.
A chilling thought, but incredibly relevant to our current cultural moment.
It really is.
Thank you for joining this deep dive on Reformed thinking.